What makes an excellent leader? And are they really that scarce? And what do they do to merit such exceptional compensation? Welcome to the Excellent Executive Coaching Podcast. Your host is one of the world's leading experts on international leadership. She's a master certified coach and facilitates a mastermind for CEOs of international companies. She's the author of 3 books, Abrasive Leaders, Global Nomadic Leaders, and Managing Brilliant Jerks. She has worked with Nestle, Novartis, and even the United Nations. She's especially good at helping executives fast track to the C-suite. Welcome, Dr. Katrina Burrus.
Welcome to the Excellent Executive Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Katrina Burrus, and today we're going to interview Arthur Woods. He is a specialist in diversity and inclusion in the workplace. And our today's focus will be a little more in comparison. What does diversity mean in Europe versus the US? Arthur, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Katrina. It's great to be here.
So tell us a little bit about how can companies reduce bias when they hire?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, it goes without saying that every organization we meet is focused heavily on how they can increase the diversity of their workforce. And so much of this, we find, Katrina, comes down to lifting the friction in our systems. When we are hiring and when we're bringing people in and when we're looking at our existing workforce, there are decisions happening at every single stage of the process that can be inequitable, right? It's partly because we are typically trying to process so much information in any given moment, in any given decision. And a lot of the information we process when we make decisions is done basically with implicit bias. And so, the way that we can best combat bias when we're hiring and when we're making decisions that affect our people is to slow down and try to lead with structure. It's usually when we are not thoughtful and intentional, when we are not operating in any consistent way, that we end up making decisions that oftentimes are just based on our previous experiences and usually use shorthand heuristics that can lead to inequity. So, we look at the interview process, right? Where a lot of people walk into an interview without any preparation, any structure. They make up questions as they go. And that is exactly what can lead to inequity. So we talk a lot in our book and in our work at Mathison about structure and consistency to combat
give
bias.
us an example of structure. What is your, let's say, recommended structure?
Sure. So the best thing to do is to focus in on a specific part of the hiring process or the talent process that we're trying to improve. And so we use the example of interviewing, right? In interviewing, we recommend scheduling 15 minutes to prepare for your interview, partly because when we improvise in an interview and we make questions up as we go, we're not operating in any consistent way. So one candidate might have a vastly different experience in that interview than another candidate. So we recommend scheduling 15 minutes of preparation time, actually deciding on the questions that we will ask the candidate ahead of time. So we have a really clear sense of what we're trying to cover, trying to use an objective way of grading a candidate's answers that we can consistently apply to the next interview that we have. And then not falling into groupthink, not, trying to go chat with colleagues about the interview before we come up with our own independent ideas and feedback, trying to code those in ahead of time so we're, operating basically independently.
Great recommendations. So what do you see as the biggest problems in companies when they hire? What would you say are their biggest challenges? So you gave us a structure, a recommended structure, which is great. But in your experience working on these issues in companies, where do they fall through? Any one of these issues in particular?
So it's a great question. The first thing that we see is that a lot of companies overall are just moving way too quickly. So if we think about, the great resignation that we have seen globally, right? We've seen it throughout Europe. We've seen it in the United States. So many companies, as you know, Katrina, are struggling to fill roles. They have a talent shortage. They have a talent shortage that extends to the actual people on their teams that are making hiring decisions. And that, moving quickly is oftentimes resulting in making very shorthand and inequitable decisions. So the first thing we say is slow down, right? The more that we slow down and we take our time, the more that we will make, we hope to be very fair and equitable decisions. We actually see that a lot of organizations have a narrow definition of diversity. There have been, many organizations that don't think about all the different dimensions of diversity that include the disability community, the veteran community, the community of older and experienced workers, right? That makes up a large part of our workforce today. And so we tell employers the more that they can become very intentional and inclusive and holistic about how they think about where there's a lack of representation on their teams, the more that they will be able to account for new communities in their goals and in their efforts.
So tell companies that say, oh, this diversity is a passing fade. What's the benefit of having a diverse workforce? What would you answer to them?
Yes. So, well, first of all, the beautiful thing about this work is that in the last 10 years, there have been so many different studies, white papers, research endeavors that have been proving the business case for diversity. One of those is that companies that actually have a more diverse workforce actually financially outperform others that do not. And that's been proven in public filings of companies that have a higher diversity on their management teams, right? It's been proven by McKinsey that companies that have greater diversity are more likely to innovate and develop new products because they have different thought, diversity of thought internally. We've also seen that companies that have a more diverse workforce are more likely to retain their people longer. So across every core aspect of how we gauge success in business, financial returns, innovation, retention, and engagement of your employees, there has been actually a business case and a correlation to diversity. I think we also step back, honestly, Katrina, and we look at, for an organization that is navigating changing times, right, that we've seen so much uncertainty in the workforce this last 2 years, especially. I think a lot of leaders are just realizing at a more pragmatic level, the more that they have diversity of thought in their workforce, the more they're actually likely to basically be relevant, to serve a diversity in their customer base, and also just to continue to stay agile. So I think leaders are really beginning to see that, they don't even need to see the research to understand that diversity is a competitive advantage.
Could you give us a little comparison of how maybe people see diversity in Europe, where they're surrounded by different countries, different languages, different cultures, compared to the U.S., who is a huge country with similar language, the same language, I would say, and similarity in the culture? Or am I being reductive?
No, it's a really great question. So first of all, I think it's important to note that across the United States versus EMEA, there are, very different regulations around what can be tracked and reported. So with GDPR, of course, in Europe, when someone applies to a job today, it's limited in terms of how they can self-identify their diverse traits. Whereas in the United States, actually, because of federal regulation, if you are a federal contractor, for example, there's a requirement for equal opportunity employment, where a company actually needs to be tracking the gender and ethnicity of their applicants, right? So very different regulatory landscapes, which do already start to change the paradigm of how diversity is kind of seen and how it's managed, right? We believe that when it comes to representation, we always have to look at the local context of the geography where we're hiring. So we do a lot of work throughout EMEA, throughout APAC, and as well as in the States. And in the United States, the major trends are not only focusing on gender diversity and ethnic diversity, but also, expanding the horizons to include the LGBTQ community, the disability community, the older experienced worker community. There's actually been quite a bit of conversation around the formerly incarcerated community. So, we write in our book about 12 different underrepresented groups. What's important to note in EMEA, of course, is that there's been a major push for gender diversity. And I think we continue to see a huge opportunity and need there. And I'm so excited to see that continues to be at the forefront. We do see great inroads being made in terms of the disability community and the disability community getting more and more of a voice. But certainly we see that we always have to contextualize the conversation based on the local country. To your point, Katrina, it's very common, across EMEA that a person might speak multiple languages, might have a heritage from multiple countries, and there might be rich cultural diversity, but that diversity might not show up in other areas such as gender or ethnicity. So those are some things that we try to think about.
Right, very interesting. Very interesting. So what are some of the helpful tools for European, Asian, or American companies that will help with the strategies to have more diversity and to make better decisions in regards to diversity?
Absolutely. So the very first thing that we recommend is to be intentional about how we scope our roles and how we actually write our job descriptions. If we think about the whole hiring process, right? The way that we actually decide on the requirements for a job that we're hiring for are truly the foundation of the house, right? Everything is built on that foundation. So there are a lot of companies that are hiring. Again, they're in that mode of hiring quickly. And the first thing they say is, let me go find a template for a job. Let me try to draft this quickly so we can get this posted and we can go start sourcing. And they don't actually step back and ask the question, what are the requirements we put in that job and what barriers might they present, right? So we work with a lot of employers that say, I want an advanced degree for every single candidate that is applying for this job. I want an exorbitant amount of experience in very specific job areas. I want a range of preferred qualifications that aren't required, but we want to add in. So maybe we get even higher caliber of candidates. And what we talk about is every time we layer in these additional credentials, degrees, vast years of experience, and even preferred qualifications, we actually really risk limiting the pool of underrepresented candidates we can recruit. So we have a whole set of resources that is centered around helping employers to craft job descriptions and role requirements in a more equitable way. And that is all centered around actually reducing the minimal requirements and focusing more on the skills and experiences that you're trying to look at for a job seeker. And if we think about actually what happens when we focus more on a person's skills and experience is you might find really unconventional job seekers that didn't go to maybe the perfect school, or maybe they didn't have the exact same experience that you might be looking for, but they actually might have all the right competencies and skills required to do the job.
Okay, give us an example, because of course let's say I take the voice of the company and says, of course, we want very well educated people. Why should we choose less educated when we can have someone that is cum laude or whatever from the top universities? Especially when it's a high-paying job.
Well, and honestly, Katrina, that's exactly the mindset that I think a lot of leaders do have, right?
Right. So how do you address it?
Right. Yes. How do you address it? So I'm a leader, right? I'm hiring for a management level position, and I am looking for someone because I've previously recruited, from a certain school that's very prestigious, or from a person that has worked at a really prestigious employer. I might use that as my shorthand way of vetting out qualified candidates. But when I'm doing that, what I'm essentially doing is I'm cutting out a lot of people who might not have been afforded those same opportunities, but actually might have all the right skills and experience needed. So let's just take an example. What if I'm hiring an engineering manager, right? And the first thing I say is I want an engineering manager who went to MIT or went to Oxford, right? Has been through really great credentials. And I want someone who has worked at Google. I want someone who has worked at a place like Facebook. What I'm actually doing when I set all these requirements is I'm really limiting the pool to what we have found to be sometimes a very homogenous pool of job seekers. So all of a sudden my applicants are a lot of white men, straight white men. And so I've cut out a lot of job seekers who, again, might have all the right experience for that role, but don't have those credentials. So our recommendation is let's go back to that role and focus on the engineering skills that someone needs to have. If they have management experience, if they have, maybe someone taught themselves how to code and had a job, didn't even go to university, but has 10 years of really great engineering experience. Would we not speak to that person if we knew that they actually had that level of experience, right? So again, this is how we're trying to get leaders to reframe what they're looking for, is if someone has all the right skills and experience and can be successful in the role, but doesn't have the same credentials, let's find a way to give them an opportunity to be part of this hiring process.
Okay, I'm curious, Arthur, how did you get interested in this area? Have you have any personal experience where you were discriminated against?
Absolutely. So, in my personal experience, Katrina, I'm a member of the LGBTQ community. I started my career actually not being out at work. I hid the fact that I was gay in my very first job interviews. I actually have a story of overhearing a homophobic slur among interviewers that I was speaking to. And honestly, it set me into a mode of really believing I wasn't safe to be my full self at work. And it wasn't until I personally stepped into a much more inclusive hiring process and a much more inclusive team that I really felt empowered and safe to be my full self at work. And I am a person, as a white man, I've been afforded privilege in other ways, but having that experience of not feeling safe in a capacity of my identity made me very passionate about ways that we create greater equity for the rest of the workforce. And particularly, folks who come from, intersectionally diverse communities. Imagine the person who identifies in multiple underrepresented groups and who's faced amazing headwinds, in their job process, hasn't been afforded all the same opportunities. How do we make sure that we create equitable paths for people to have opportunities? That's really been my mission in life, in this aspect of my career. And we get to work with, hundreds of employers who are really committed holistically to diversity, helping them navigate this change.
Thank you for sharing your personal experience. It gives a better understanding of your mission, really. You also have valuable insights that you can share from your work with YouTube's education division. Can you do that?
Absolutely. So, early in my career, I had the opportunity to work at Google and to help launch YouTube's education division. It was a time when YouTube was mostly focused just on the entertainment content and entertainment vertical. And we realized the platform could be a powerful agent for education and helping people around the world access content that wouldn't be available to them otherwise. And so I was really part of that work. And honestly, Katrina, this was an early lesson for me in equity as well, right? You think about how privileged we are when we have access to the internet and we can go and access training and content and we can learn and all of the amazing lifelong learning tools and resources people have access to. And yet for many people around the world, they don't have access to knowledge. And this to me was actually the start of, a longer journey, which is equitable access to education directly leads to our access to opportunities in the workforce. And so for me, I, sort of started my career in, equitable education, and it really kind of naturally led me to this focus on equitable workforce.
Very interesting. Right. Very interesting. Thank you very much. We're coming to the end of our podcast, and I would like to know, where can our listeners contact you?
Absolutely. So we have a company called Mathison that is a technology platform that helps employers measure and manage their diversity strategy from a hiring standpoint and from a training standpoint. And folks can go on to learn about us at Mathison.io. Mathison was the middle name of Alan Turing. And very similar to Turing and how, he cracked the Enigma code, our mission is to help organizations and leaders crack the diversity code. So they can learn about us there. And then our book, which came out just a few months ago, is called Hiring for Diversity. And it's a whole, really comprehensive resource to help leaders navigate inclusive hiring. And it really, Katrina, speaks to the themes that we talked about today around how to, very tangible things you can do at every stage of the hiring process to be more equitable and to reduce bias.
Excellent.
So,
excellent.
Yeah.
So these will all be on the show notes, and thanks for sharing. So I encourage my listeners to purchase your book. I think they'll get great insight. Thank you so very much, Arthur. This was great.
Thank you so much, Katrina. Yeah. It's wonderful being with you, and thanks for so many of the thoughtful questions today.
Thank you. We would love to know what you thought of this podcast. Write us an email at drkatrina with a K at excellentexecutivecoaching.com. We would love to hear what you liked and what we could improve. This podcast has been sponsored by excellentexecutivecoaching.com.
Thank you for listening to the Excellent Executive Coaching Podcast. You can subscribe to all future podcasts at excellentexecutivecoaching.com. Join us each Wednesday to learn more about the latest trends in leadership techniques and bring your coaching to the next level. To learn more about Dr. Burrus' CEO Mastermind, use the contact form at excellentexecutivecoaching.com.